Vampires. One of the quintessential movie monsters, wouldn't you agree? Maybe you're picturing a gothic, looming creature of the night, akin to Nosferatu. Or, like many people part of this generation, a sparkly 17-year-old dreamboat with a secret. Well, the cool thing about these monsters is that even if you did picture the former or the latter or both or something completely different, you wouldn't be wrong. The image of the vampire has changed so much over recent years that there's been this really cool cultural shift in that there isn't really the paramount vampire anymore. When it comes to vampires, there is one glaring discrepancy that sets them apart from Frankenstein's monster or even King Kong. They aren't gendered. Bram Stoker's Dracula is no exception. And if we're talking semantics when it comes to the definition of paramount, then I guess, yeah, Count Dracula himself would kind of be the poster child for vampires. But the point is, there have been so many different incarnations of the monster that a female vampire isn't really out of the question. In my opinion, the concept of the female vampire is something we can really sink our teeth into. She is almost an entirely different monster compared to her male counterpart, and she is heavily represented in Dracula multiple times, and also a Girl Book's Home Alone at Night as the lone monster. In Emma Dominguez-Rue's article entitled Sins of the Flesh, Anorexia, Eroticism and the Female Vampire in Bram Stoker's Dracula, she details how the female vampire was designed to reflect the Victorian woman. Emma Dominguez-Rue highlights that a skeletal woman was considered fashionable. The example she uses is the woman as an accessory, as a symbol of wealth. For a wealthy Victorian man, having an unproductive wife exhibited their opposition to a typically large, fleshy, working-class woman. In fact, this is how the unfathomably small corsets we often correlate with the Victorian era came to be. The article cites Silver's claim, the erotic appeal of a woman's small waist derives from her physical weakness and vulnerability, which juxtaposes with a man's strength. When you think about it, a small waist has always been in vogue. From the buxom body standards of the 1950s to the 1990s idolization of heroin chic, a small waist never really went out of style. Dijkstra describes anorexia as attempts to conform to the morbidly attractive ideal of the sublime consumptive. He writes that this consumptive look was thought to be evidence of a saintly disposition. When going back to what Silver writes, the waist signifies women's ethereal nature, the aerial qualities that separate her from a man. A woman's light weight suggests her spiritual rather than carnal nature. We can see where the generalized attractiveness of a small waist and emaciated aesthetic comes from, but how does this connect to the female vampire? Dominguez-Rue notes that although women were idealized as angelic beings, they were simultaneously fielded as sexually voracious monsters. And Hayward writes that womanhood had been described as devouring, insatiable, hungering, voracious, without restraint, always wanting. Dominguez-Rue says of Silver's article, Victorian culture associated body fat with an unrestrained sexual appetite. Dominguez-Rue then goes on to describe female vampires by saying, the vampire displays all the main physical characteristics of the anorexic woman, thus becoming a hyperbolic manifestation of Victorian femininity. The female vampire is not only sexually voracious, but in the general sense of the word, she is hungry, which is the antithesis of the idolized anorexic woman. By this framework, we can conclude that the ideal Victorian woman looked emaciated and consumptive and repressed her sexual urges. So what happens when you are confronted with the pinnacle of female beauty coupled with overt sexuality and eroticism? The female vampire. Moving on to Dracula, Silver notes that the act of eating becomes not only aesthetically unacceptable, but also unnatural and grotesque. Dominguez-Rue goes on to say, the female vampire thereby becomes an exaggerated representation of the Victorian culture of anorexia personifying male fears about women and unrestrained appetites. It's important to remember that Bram Stoker himself was a Victorian man, and Dracula was written towards the end of Queen Victoria's reign. To him, this was not a historical capturing of Victorian life that he had studied, and it was not a far-off futuristic story either. It was a supernatural allegory for what was going on around him at the time of writing. When looking at Stoker's two examples of the female vampire, Mina and Lucy, Dominguez-Rue writes, Stoker's description of them is already indicative of their propensity to vampirism. Their potentially voracious nature is significantly revealed through images of eating. In fact, Mina says in Dracula, "I believe we should have shocked the new woman with our appetites." This further emphasizes the rigid dichotomy between the new woman and the female vampire and accentuates my aforementioned note about the parallels between genuine hunger and sexual hunger. Showalter notes, a carnivorous diet in women was associated with uncontrolled lust, and it was even thought to bring about nymphomania. So now we know that Dracula's female vampires well and truly represented the antithetical new woman, but what about Anna Lily Amirpour's A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night? How does her character represent the female vampire? Well, the girl aesthetically reflects the female vampire for sure. She is definitely sylph-like, not necessarily to the extreme of anorexia, but thin nonetheless. And since she is the main character, we see that she is undeniably gluttonous when it comes to the blood of her victims. That is not to say, however, that all of her victims are innocents, as the overarching context of the film is that we only ever see her prey on bad people. She has an opportunity to kill Arash, but doesn't, and instead they fall in love. The film itself is not about a vampire at all. It's actually about its feminist themes. The same goes for Dracula. Elijah Wood, one of the producers of A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night, said about Dracula, "I thought I was going to be reading a novel that was a horror novel, that it was going to be filled with vampire lore, but it's not. It's a love story." I think Wood put it perfectly when he said that Dracula is not about vampires, and neither is A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night. They both address themes relevant to the time periods they are a product of. The common theme among them is rebelling against the contemporary ideals of femininity. Unlike the female vampire's male counterpart, she is always changing, she is always relevant, and she is always a symbol of revolt. That is what makes her such a powerful image.